Well, the Scottish Trans Alliance have been articulating their logic in the Herald this week. Now, you pay for the Scottish Trans Alliance through your taxes, so you might want to listen to what they have to say. Many decades of research have solidly established that the gender identity in which trans people live is more accurate than the observation of their genitals at birth. Now, to compare the accuracy of two means of identification, you need a third means that's more accurate than the other two that you can compare them with. So, for example, if you had two rulers and you measured a stick, one ruler said it was 9.6 centimetres, the other one said it was 9.8 centimetres. How would you know which one was more accurate? Well, you'd need to know how long the stick actually was. You'd need a third means to compare them to. Becky Kaufman, who's writing this, she doesn't tell us what the definitive identification method is at this point. But more accurate for determining what? Let's let her go on to make it clearer. Looking at the gender identity people live in is a more accurate reflection of their gender identity than their genitals. Okay, so looking at gender identity is the most accurate means of determining gender identity. Okay, that's what's known as a truism. It can't possibly be false because it doesn't say anything. But of course, in this case, gender identity is defined as a subjective sense of maleness, femaleness, or whatever elseness. So how exactly does science establish that? What sort of experiment did they do? Do you have someone in a white coat and then you say to someone, what gender identity do you live in? And they'd say, a man. Then you say to them, what's your gender identity? And they'd say, a man. And you say, oh, it matches. Scientific evidence, eureka, we've discovered the deep scientific law behind gender identity. So gender identity is a scientifically verifiable fact. Okay, they say this is not about feelings, it's about the observable fact of how people exist and interact with society. Okay, so the observable fact, for example, that a man's wearing a dress is scientifically verifiable, yes, but that's the outworking of his subjective feelings. I mean, by this logic, if I identified as a fish, the scientifically verifiable fact that I lie down to some chips and peas establishes the scientific objectivity of my fishy identity. What? So Becky Kaufman of the Scottish Trans Alliance is now handing over the baton to Tim Hopkins of the Equality Network. Now, the Scottish Trans Alliance is actually part of the Equality Network. They're basically the same organisation, just with a different mask on. Anyway, what's Tim got to say? He talks about the inappropriateness of defining gender by physical sex characteristics. That's because he's redefined gender as meaning subjective feeling of maleness, femaleness, or whatever else-ness. And he argues thus: is a man whose testicles are removed because of cancer then less of a man? Of course not. And to say that would be highly offensive to those men. Now, I've made this sort of point in the past. I used the example of, for example, a man was kidnapped against his will and subjected to sex change procedures. And after a year or so, he might escape, go back to his family. When he went to his kids and said, oh, your dad's back, would anyone say, no, not anymore, you're their mum now? And when he said to his wife, your husband's back, would anyone say, no, you're not a husband anymore, you're a wife? When he says, I'm a man, would anyone say, no, you're not, you've had a sex change, you're a woman now? Of course no one would say that. And that demonstrates that we don't really believe the sex change surgery changes people's sex, because you can't change sex. Now, Mr. Hopkins reaches the opposite conclusion. He thinks that it shows that gender is unrelated to sex characteristics. In other words, being a man or a woman is nothing to do with biology. So in my illustration of the man kidnapped, the reason he's still a man, according to Mr. Hopkins, is because he still thinks he is, and he still feels that he is. Now, sex change surgery doesn't change a man into a woman, because maleness and femaleness is written into every cell of our body. You can't change the makeup of our entire physical being. But he thinks it's just down to what you feel. So Mr. Hopkins says, because removing genitals from a man doesn't make him into a woman, being a man or a woman is nothing to do with biological sex differences. Whereas I say, removing genitals from a man doesn't make him into a woman, because being a man or a woman is determined by biological sex differences in every cell of the body. To use an analogy, it's as though he's saying, take a wheel off a car and it's still a car. This shows that being a car has nothing to do with having wheels or any other sort of components. Therefore, absolutely anything can be called a car, including a tin opener. Whereas by analogy, I would be saying, take a wheel off a car and you've got a car with a wheel missing. But that doesn't mean that a tin opener can be a special sort of car with no wheels, engine, seats, chassis, brakes, suspension, steering, or anything else. Well, let's give the Scottish Trans Alliance one more opportunity to express their opinion. Right, this is an article from the Telegraph this week. A transgender murderer serving a life sentence has been given the green light for gender reassignment surgery on the NHS, probably going to cost about £80,000. The surgery, which is supported by transgender rights campaigners, was given the go-ahead last week and is scheduled to begin within weeks. Green, 27, was found guilty of murder and jailed for life in 2013 after she tortured, sexually assaulted and beat a man to death with 2 accomplices. Since being incarcerated, Green from Glenrothes, Fife, has been removed from the women's prison for sexually assaulting other inmates. One officer said, "Most of the people I've discussed this with think it's outrageous. You can murder someone brutally, but while you're in prison you're entitled to everything you ask for, no matter the burden it puts on a stretched system, because it might breach your human rights to say no." What about the rights of the victims and his family? Is anyone thinking of them? Is it not another slap in the face they could do without? Another officer added, "This will be a logistical and security nightmare for the prison service and for the health service. They have more important things to worry about. This is not a life-saving operation. It's not vital to keep Green healthy. If you're serving life for murder, I think some things should be outside your reach, and this is one of them." That's what the prison officers think. Quite right, I think. But let's hear from James Morton, the Scottish Trans Alliance manager. The principle that prisoners should receive the same standard of NHS care as the rest of society is legally established in the UK. So the Scottish Trans Alliance is right behind it. And that's your taxes paying for them. I'll put a link below, it's quite interesting. It talks about the suggestion that a disproportionately large number of transgender prisoners are actually sexual offenders. You can have a look at that if you're interested. So no surprises at the conclusion of this video. We would defund the Scottish Trans Alliance. Now that might be quite tricky because they're embedded within the equality network. It might be quite hard to disentangle the two. We'll think of some way to solve that problem, possibly in a future video. The money saved, what would you use it for? Well, we want to have a transferable tax allowance between married couples. This could go towards that, or maybe you could choose some other priority where you'd like this money going to instead of to the Scottish Trans Alliance. And in chopping this sock puppet charity, we'd be saving money and making Scotland a more open and democratic nation in the process. Right, thanks for watching. We're a political party. Do join us. There's a link below. You could subscribe to us on YouTube. Bye for now.